It was a frigid December evening in the remote countryside of Maine. I had agreed to house sit for a neighbor who also asked me to look after his dog, Max. Though I wasn't thrilled about it, I decided to help out. The temperature outside was brutal, but I couldn't let Max roam the yard alone. There were no fences, and he could easily wander into the dense woods and get lost. Reluctantly, I prepared to take him on a walk. My neighbor had left an old, fraying red leash for Max, and as soon as I clipped it to his collar, he tugged me toward the door with surprising strength. I could already tell he was going to be a handful. Stepping outside felt like stepping into a freezer. The icy air cut through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. I wanted to get this walk over with as quickly as possible. I jogged a little with Max to warm up, but he suddenly stopped to sniff around one of the countless pines lining the dirt road. I thought he was finally going to do his business, but then he perked up, ears alert, and stared into the woods. Without warning, Max started barking furiously and pulled at the leash, trying to drag me into the forest. I struggled to hold him back, but the leash snapped at a weak point, and Max bolted into the darkness, his barks echoing through the trees until they faded away. I sprinted after him, shouting his name into the cold, silent night. He must have been chasing a deer or some other small animal, but with only the dim light from my phone, I knew I had little chance of finding him. My only hope was that he would come back on his own. I stopped and listened, calling for Max over and over. Suddenly, I heard footsteps nearby and felt a surge of hope that Max was returning. But as the footsteps grew louder, I realized they were too heavy and deliberate to belong to a dog. They sounded like human footsteps, slow and purposeful, crunching through the snow. A chill ran down my spine. I turned off my phone's light, now convinced I was not alone in the woods. The footsteps seemed to circle around me, and I couldn't tell if it was intentional or if whoever it was hadn't seen me yet. I began to creep back toward the road, careful to step lightly. The sound of the footsteps grew faint, then stopped altogether. I wasn't sure if they had faded away or if I had simply stopped noticing them. I felt a momentary relief and quickened my pace, eager to get back to the safety of the road. But then, as I looked ahead, I realized I was walking directly toward a dark figure standing with its back to me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I froze in place, trying not to make a sound. The figure was motionless, facing a large tree. I took a deep breath and, against my better judgment, called out, asking if they had seen my dog. There was no response. The figure remained perfectly still, a hood obscuring their face. My curiosity got the better of me, and I reached out to touch their shoulder. My hand met something hard and wooden. I stepped around to face the figure and felt my blood run cold. Inside the hood there was no face, just a long wooden stick holding up a coat and hood. It was a crude dummy, standing eerily in the woods. My mind raced. If this was a dummy, then whatever had made those footsteps was still out here, lurking. Panic overtook me, and I ran, not caring how much noise I made. I sprinted back to the road, then up the hill to the house, slamming the door behind me. Max never came back, and I never dared to go back into those woods to look for him. Telling my neighbor was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. He was devastated, and I couldn't blame him. We weren't close to begin with, and this certainly didn't help. That night, I had a nightmare that I was back in the house, and I could hear Max's barking coming from the woods. A desperate, frightened bark. I woke up, heart racing, and looked out the window, hoping it was real. But the woods were silent. I don't know what happened to Max, and I don't know who or what was out there with me that night. I don't think I want to know. One weekend, my aunt, Jane, and Uncle Rob asked me to house sit while they took a trip to the coast. They didn't want to take their dog to a kennel, so they asked if I could watch her at their place. I was excited to do it because they were offering good money, and their home was an absolute dream. Huge, with all sorts of entertainment. Their dog, Daisy, a small Havanese, was calm and easygoing. I just needed to feed her twice a day and let her out in the backyard. Daisy had a habit of following me wherever I went. If I was lounging in their massive living room, she'd be curled up in the center of the room. If I decided to head down to their basement to play video games, she'd trot right along and settle near me. It was during one of these video game sessions in the basement when things got strange. Daisy suddenly lifted her head and stared toward the dark, open doorway leading to the storage room. Having had a dog before, I knew they could react to the smallest noises, but the way Daisy stared made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The room beyond was pitch black and silent. There was no way I was going in there. Trying to shake off my unease, I resumed my game. But Daisy remained tense, her gaze still fixed on the doorway. A few moments later, she did it again, lifted her head, ears perked, eyes glued to the storage room. I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned off the game, deciding I'd had enough of the basement. I coaxed Daisy up the stairs, shutting the basement door behind us a bit too quickly. Jane and Rob had another game room on the main floor, down a narrow hallway. Daisy followed me there, and I tried to focus on playing more games, but my mind kept wandering back to the basement. After a while, I decided to call it a night. I headed to the guest room they had set up for me, which, honestly, was nicer than my bedroom back home. After changing into some pajamas, I climbed into bed, flicked on the TV, and Daisy settled by the bedside. I was growing fond of her calm presence. Eventually, I turned off the TV and drifted into a restless sleep. I was jolted awake by a low growling sound. I turned on the bedside lamp and saw Daisy lying on the floor, her head down but growling softly at something. I called her name softly, but she didn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the closet door, a sliding wooden door slightly ajar, about 3 inches. My heart began to race. I could see nothing but darkness in the closet, but Daisy's unwavering stare sent a wave of dread through me. I decided to investigate, moving slowly, trying to see through the small crack. I got about 5 feet from the door when something shifted in the dark, a movement just out of sight. Then, suddenly, an eye appeared in the gap of the door. I froze. It was unmistakable, a human eye staring directly at me through the crack. My breath caught in my throat. Panic surged through me. I grabbed Daisy and bolted for the front door, grabbing my phone from the counter as I ran out of the house. I called 911, heart pounding, trying to explain what happened. It was close to 2 a.m., but I didn't care. I wasn't going back inside until the police arrived. When they did, the officers did a thorough sweep of the house. I waited outside with Daisy, my stomach in knots. One of the officers came back out and told me they found a man hiding in the pantry downstairs. I didn't see him. Another officer kept me outside, talking to calm me down. I was just relieved that they found him and took him away. I went back inside, knowing I was safe, thanks to Daisy, who just might have saved my life that night. One evening, I agreed to dog sit for a neighbor, Mrs. Gladys, to earn a bit of extra cash. Mrs. Gladys was an eccentric old woman, known around the neighborhood for her peculiar habits and reclusive nature. She rarely spoke to anyone unless it was about her beloved dog, Hazel. So when she asked me to take care of Hazel while she was supposedly visiting family in another state, she seemed desperate. She insisted I stay in her house rather than bring Hazel to mine. She practically begged me, outlining in exhaustive detail what I should and shouldn't do while taking care of her dog. Hazel, a small white fluffy dog, likely a Bichon Frise, was adorable in appearance but had a high-pitched bark that grated on my nerves. As soon as Mrs. Gladys left, Hazel started barking at every tiny noise. I could tell this was going to be a long night. Mrs. Gladys had set me up in a sparse guest room with only a single twin-sized bed and a small desk. The room felt cold and unwelcoming, much like the rest of her old, creaky house. I had brought my Xbox with the intention of playing some games to pass the time. However, Mrs. Gladys's TV was ancient. It didn't even have an HDMI port, so I was out of luck. Instead, I resigned myself to playing games on my phone, with Hazel's constant yapping as my background noise. I fed her once, as instructed, and then tried to make the best of the situation. Thankfully, I was only committed to this for one night. With nothing else to do, I decided to do a bit of snooping around the house. Mrs. Gladys had strictly told me not to go into her bedroom, but curiosity got the better of me. I found her room slightly ajar and peeked inside. It was like stepping into a time capsule. The furniture was old and covered in dust. In the center of the room was a large, ornate rug with a faded, intricate pattern that looked almost like something from an old tapestry. By 9 p.m., I was ready to call it a night. I assumed Hazel would curl up somewhere in Mrs. Gladys's room, which was fine by me. I just wanted to sleep and get this bizarre experience over with. But deep into the night, I was jolted awake by Hazel's incessant barking. I shouted for her to stop, but the barking continued, sounding muffled and distant, as if it was coming from far below me. Confused, I got up and listened more closely. The barking seemed to be coming from Mrs. Gladys's bedroom. I tiptoed toward the sound, and as I stepped inside, I noticed that the large rug had been rolled up and pushed aside, revealing a trapdoor in the floor that was now wide open. I felt a chill run down my spine. Hazel's barking was coming from somewhere down there, deep in the darkness. I froze, paralyzed with fear. There was no way Hazel could have opened that door by herself. Someone or something must have done it. I strained my eyes to see into the black void but couldn't make out anything. My instinct was to run back home and call for help, but I couldn't just leave Hazel down there. I whispered her name softly, hoping she would come running up from the darkness, but the barking abruptly stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence, and then something moved. From the dark depths of the opening, a hand slowly emerged, gripping the edge of the trapdoor. It was a man's hand. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest as I faced a fight-or-flight scenario. As a scared 15-year-old, I chose flight. I ran out of the house as fast as my legs could carry me, racing across the lawn to my house next door. I burst through the front door, screaming for my parents. My dad immediately called the police and reported a possible break-in. When the officers arrived, I watched from a safe distance as they entered Mrs. Gladys's house. They went to her bedroom, but when they came back out, they said the rug was back in place and the trap door was closed. They still opened it and found a dark crawl space beneath the floor. It was filled with strange objects, but there was no sign of Hazel or anyone else. The next day, Mrs. Gladys returned, and my dad confronted her about what happened. She flew into a rage, screaming about demons making noises below her house at night. Then she broke down sobbing about Hazel, claiming that the spirits must have taken her beloved dog. It was all too bizarre. Since that day, my family and I have avoided her. She rarely leaves her house and we don't speak. I still get chills thinking about that night, the hand in the dark and the eerie, muffled barking. Some mysteries are best left unsolved, and this is one I hope never to revisit. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed our stories and would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you captivating tales and new content every week. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We appreciate every one of you for being a part of our storytelling journey.